Picture the Earth with no humans on it at all. No cities, no roads, no borders. Just 3.5 billion years of trial and error, written in bone and rock. For most of that time, something else sat on the throne. Not one species, many. One after another, a new monster clawed its way to the top of the food chain, ruled for a while, and then lost everything. We tend to think of dominance as permanent. It never was. The crown changed heads again and again, swallowed by ice, drowned by falling oxygen, erased by a rock from space. Here's the thesis this whole video is built on. The top of the food chain was never a throne. It was a lease, and every tenant, without exception, got evicted. By the end of this list, you'll meet the single most dominant land predator that ever lived, and you'll watch its entire kingdom disappear. In what is, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. So let's start small. Let's start in a swamp, 300 million years ago, with something that shouldn't have been able to exist at all. Number 10. Arthropleura, Northumberland, England, 2018. A geologist named Neil Davies is examining a sandstone block that fell from a cliff, and he finds a fossilized track, nearly a meter wide, pressed into rock formed 326 million years ago. It belongs to a millipede, not a millipede like the ones curling up in your garden. A millipede the length of a small car. Arthropleura grew past 2.5 meters, longer than most sedans, heavier than an adult human, armored in overlapping plates like a segmented tank. It didn't hunt in the way we imagine monsters hunting. It grazed through carboniferous rainforests, chewing through rotting plant matter on a planet where the air itself was different. Oxygen levels back then ran as high as 35%, compared to 21% today. That single fact explains almost everything. Higher oxygen let insects and arthropods breathe efficiently through simple tubes in their exoskeletons, so they could grow to sizes that would suffocate them in our modern atmosphere. So the throne Arthropleura sat on wasn't built from teeth or speed. It was built from chemistry. Therefore, when that chemistry changed, the throne collapsed with it. Here's the twist. Around 305 million years ago, the carboniferous rainforests began to fragment and dry out. Atmospheric oxygen dropped, and the very air that built giants started shrinking them. Arthropleura's descendants got smaller, generation after generation, until what remained were the millipedes we step over today. Some researchers push back on the full picture, arguing that oxygen alone doesn't explain gigantism in every arthropod lineage of the period, and that predation pressure and food availability likely played a role too. The debate isn't settled, but the fossils are clear on one point. Something that size walked the Earth, and nothing that size walks it now. A monster built out of air itself, strange enough. But the next name on this list didn't need strange chemistry. It just needed a river, patience, and a mouth big enough to end an argument with a dinosaur. Number 9. Deinosuchus, Big Bend, Texas, roughly 75 million years ago. A duck-billed dinosaur wades into a river to drink. It never sees what's beneath the surface. Paleontologists have found hadrosaur bones punctured by tooth marks that match only one known predator of the region. Bite marks, deep enough to have been left by an animal built like a crocodile, but scaled up like nothing alive today. Deinosuchus stretched up to 12 meters long, roughly the length of a city bus, with a skull built like a battering ram and teeth shaped like bananas, thick enough to crush turtle shells and dinosaur bone alike. It hunted the way modern crocodiles do, hidden, still, patient. But its prey wasn't wading birds or fish. Its prey was dinosaurs coming down to drink, and it had the size to drag them under. For millions of years, it ruled the riverbanks of what is now North America, and therefore, it needed no plan beyond waiting. But here's where it gets strange. Deinosuchus didn't die out in the asteroid impact that ended the dinosaurs. It vanished nearly 10 million years earlier, well before that catastrophe ever happened. Its extinction seems tied to something quieter, shifting coastlines, changing river systems, and possibly competition from other apex predators moving into its territory. Still, The debate over exactly what pushed it out remains open among paleontologists, since fossil coverage from that specific window of time is frustratingly thin. A king dethroned before the world even ended. Not every fall needs an asteroid. Sometimes the throne just quietly changes owners, and no one is left to record the moment it happened. If a crocodile could outmonster the dinosaurs on land, imagine what was waiting in the water 250 million years earlier, before dinosaurs had even been invented. Number 8. Dunkleosteus, Ohio, 1867. A quarry worker uncovers a plate of bone so thick it takes researchers decades to understand what animal it belonged to. The creature is eventually named after amateur paleontologist David Dunkel, and what scientists piece together is a fish unlike anything swimming today. Not scaled, but armored, with a skull built from interlocking bone plates instead of skin. Dunkleosteus patrolled Devonian seas roughly 360 million years ago, and depending on which reconstruction you trust, stretched somewhere between 4 and 6 meters, long enough to rival a small bus, and heavy enough that a bite from it has been calculated among the strongest of any fish that ever lived. It had no teeth. It didn't need them. Its jaw plates sharpened themselves with every bite, slicing through the armor of other fish like the very best surgical shears. So for millions of years, in a world with no whales, no sharks worth fearing, and barely any vertebrates on land at all, Dunkleosteus was simply the biggest, best-armed thing in the ocean. But here's the catch. The late Devonian extinction arrived, one of the 5 great die-offs in Earth's history, and oxygen levels in the oceans appear to have collapsed across huge stretches of seafloor. An armored predator built for combat had no answer for water that had simply stopped being breathable. Some researchers argue the extinction was gradual. Others point to a rapid series of events, and there's still no full consensus on the trigger. What is certain is that Dunkleosteus disappeared, and nothing else ever quite recreated that particular design. An armored king, undone by the ocean, turning against him from the inside. If the sea itself can dethrone a monster, what happens when the sky produces one large enough to blot out the sun? Number 7. Quetzalcoatlus, Big Bend National Park, Texas, 1971. The same badlands that hid Deinosuchus millions of years earlier. A graduate student named Douglas Lawson finds a wing bone so enormous, he initially assumes it belongs to a small aircraft's wreckage. It doesn't. It belongs to a flying reptile. Quetzalcoatlus is the largest flying animal ever confirmed to have existed, with a wingspan estimated between 10 and 11 meters, wider than the wingspan of most small private planes, and standing as tall as a giraffe when folded up on the ground. Long-necked, nearly toothless, it likely stalked late Cretaceous floodplains on foot as much as it soared above them, spearing small animals with a beak built like a javelin. It ruled 2 domains at once: the open sky, where almost nothing could challenge it, and the ground, where its height alone made it a predator few creatures wanted to test. Therefore, for the final few million years of the dinosaur era, the largest thing capable of flight was also comfortable hunting like a heron the size of a house. But here's the reversal. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, and Quetzalcoatlus, along with every other pterosaur on the planet, vanished in the same catastrophe that erased the dinosaurs. No slow decline, no competitor edging it out, just an ending shared with almost everything else alive at that moment. Some scientists have debated whether a few pterosaur lineages might have limped on briefly afterward, but the fossil record offers no confirmed survivors. The Sky King fell with everyone else, and the skies stayed empty of anything that large for tens of millions of years. But not every giant from this era died with the dinosaurs. Some of the biggest monsters on this list were only born after the old world burned down. Number 6. Titanoboa, Cerrejón Coal Mine, Northern Colombia, mid-2000s. Miners keep finding fossilized vertebrae far too large to belong to any known snake. And when paleontologist Jonathan Block's team finally assembles the picture, the numbers stop making sense, until they don't. Titanoboa measured close to 13 meters long and weighed over a metric ton, roughly the size of a city bus, with a body wide enough that, according to reconstructions, it could barely fit through a standard doorway. It lived around 60 million years ago, only a few million years after the asteroid had wiped out the dinosaurs in the sweltering, crocodile-choked swamps of prehistoric Colombia. It hunted by ambush and constriction, and fossil evidence places it in direct contact with crocodilians it was very likely capable of swallowing whole. So while the dinosaurs' extinction destroyed one world, it opened another, a warmer, wetter, reptile-friendly planet where an ambush predator with no venom and no legs could simply outmass almost everything around it. But here's the twist that makes this story stranger than the snake itself. Titanoboa's size wasn't really about hunting skill at all. It was about temperature. Snakes are ectotherms. Their body size is limited by the warmth of their environment. Titanoboa could only exist because the tropics of that era ran significantly hotter than the tropics of today. Still, that means its extinction wasn't caused by a rival predator or a lack of prey. It was caused, essentially, by the planet cooling down. As global temperatures dropped over millions of years, the physics of its own body made a creature that size impossible to sustain. A giant undone not by teeth or claws, but by a thermostat it never controlled. If a snake could rule the tropics through raw size, what happens when raw size gets teeth like knives instead? Number 5. Smilodon. Los Angeles, roughly 40,000 years ago, thick with prehistoric grassland where downtown skyscrapers now stand. An animal gets stuck in a shallow pool of natural asphalt, and its cries draw in a predator that smells easy prey. That predator gets stuck too. Over the following millennia, thousands of individuals of the same species meet the same fate in the La Brea tar pits, and it's from that unlikely trap that we know Smilodon better than almost any other Ice Age predator. Smilodon fatalis stood roughly the height of a large modern lion, but built far more powerfully, with forelimbs thick enough to wrestle prey many times its own weight, and canine teeth that grew up to 28 centimeters long, nearly the length of a kitchen knife, curving down from its upper jaw. It didn't chase prey across open plains the way a cheetah would. It ambushed, wrestled its target to the ground, and used those oversized canines for a single, precise, fatal bite. For tens of thousands of years, Smilodon sat at the top of the North and South American food chain, feeding on bison, ground sloths, and young mammoths, so its dominance depended entirely on those large, slow-moving prey animals continuing to exist in huge numbers. But here's where the ground shifts. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, the megafauna Smilodon depended on collapsed. Climate warmed rapidly. Grasslands changed to forests, and humans, recent arrivals in the Americas, were hunting many of the same large herbivores. Researchers still argue over how much blame belongs to climate change versus human hunting pressure, and the honest answer is probably both, tangled together in ways the fossil record can't fully untangle. What's certain is that when the prey disappeared, an ambush predator built entirely around killing giants had nothing left large enough to kill. A perfect hunter, starved out by the disappearance of its own hunting grounds. But North America wasn't the only continent running its own experiment in monstrous predators. On the other side of the planet, something even stranger was watching from the Australian scrub. Number 4. Megalania. Inland Queensland, Australia, tens of thousands of years ago. Aboriginal oral traditions describe enormous reptilian creatures stalking the outback long before European settlers arrived, and modern paleontology has found fossil evidence that lines up disturbingly well with those accounts. Megalania, more formally known as Varanus priscus, was a monitor lizard related to today's Komodo dragon, but estimates put its length anywhere from 5 to 7 meters, several times the size of the largest Komodo dragons alive now. Some estimates are more conservative, but even the cautious end of the range describes an animal longer than a family car. Like its modern relatives, it likely delivered a bite loaded with toxins that prevented blood from clotting, meaning prey that escaped the initial attack could still bleed out over the following hours. Therefore, Megalania didn't need to be the fastest predator in Ice Age Australia. It only needed to bite once and wait. For a continent with no big cats, no wolves, and no bears, that made it the closest thing Australia ever had to an apex land predator on the scale of the saber-tooth. Here's the catch, though. Megalania's extinction, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, lines up almost exactly with the arrival of the first humans on the Australian continent. That timing has fueled one of paleontology's longest-running arguments. Some researchers argue humans hunted Australia's megafauna into extinction directly. Others point to a major shift toward a drier climate around the same period, arguing the two events are coincidence more than cause and effect. The truth is likely a combination neither side wants to fully admit, and no fossil evidence has settled the argument either way. A venomous giant, erased in a controversy that's still running 50,000 years later. But while Australia lost its most extreme predator to mystery, the northern half of the planet was about to lose something even larger. And its extinction is far better documented, right down to the exact century. Number 3, the woolly mammoth. Wrangel Island, Siberian Arctic, around 1650 BCE, while the pyramids of Egypt were already more than 1,000 years old, and Stonehenge had already been standing for centuries. A small, isolated population of woolly mammoths is still alive here, the very last of a species that once dominated an entire hemisphere. At its peak, the woolly mammoth stood up to 4 meters tall and weighed as much as 6 metric tons, roughly the mass of a loaded school bus, insulated by a double layer of fur and a thick hump of fat that let it survive temperatures cold enough to kill almost anything else. It didn't dominate through speed or teeth. It dominated through sheer ecological reach, grazing across the vast Mammoth Steppe, a grassland ecosystem that stretched from Spain to Canada during the Ice Age, shaping the landscape wherever it walked. So for hundreds of thousands of years, the mammoth wasn't just a predator's meal or a monster in the modern sense. It was closer to a keystone giant, an animal whose grazing habits kept entire grasslands alive. But therefore, when the Ice Age ended and the climate warmed rapidly, that grassland began collapsing into forest and tundra, shrinking the very habitat the mammoth depended on to survive. Here's the twist most people never learn. Mammoths didn't vanish all at once with the rest of the Ice Age megafauna. Small populations clung on for thousands of years longer, and the very last of them, isolated on Wrangel Island with no predators and shrinking genetic diversity, didn't die out until around 1650 BCE, meaning mammoths were still alive on Earth, while ancient Egyptian civilization was already old news. Still, scientists continue debating exactly how much of the mammoth's disappearance came from climate change versus human hunting on the mainland, since both pressures overlapped for thousands of years before that final Arctic population blinked out. A giant that shaped continents, reduced in the end to one shrinking island and one final act of genetic bad luck. Land had given us its biggest names, but the deepest, largest kingdom on the planet, the ocean, was still holding its final champion in reserve. Number 2. Megalodon, off the coast of Peru, roughly 3.5 million years ago. A pod of small whales moves through warm coastal waters, unaware that something below them has been the apex predator of Earth's oceans for over 15 million years already, and is about to demonstrate exactly why. Otodus megalodon is known almost entirely from teeth and vertebrae, since shark skeletons are made of cartilage that rarely fossilizes, but those teeth alone, some measuring over 18 centimeters, have let scientists estimate a length between 15 and 20 meters, roughly 3 times the length of a modern great white shark, with a bite force calculated as the strongest of any predator ever measured. It specialized in hunting whales, and fossil whale bones bearing megalodon bite marks show attacks aimed directly at the flippers and tail, crippling prey before delivering a killing blow. For roughly 20 million years, across nearly every ocean on the planet, megalodon simply had no rival. Therefore, its extinction, which paleontologists now place around 3.5 to 4 million years ago, required more than one collapsing factor to bring it down. Ocean temperatures dropped, sea levels shifted, destroying the warm coastal nurseries young megalodons depended on to survive their most vulnerable years. And a new competitor, the great white shark, was rising through the same waters, hunting some of the same prey with a leaner, more efficient body. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. For decades, rumors and pseudo-documentaries have suggested Megalodon might still be alive somewhere in the deep ocean. Marine biologists, including researchers who study deep-sea ecosystems for institutions like ONU, have consistently pointed out that an apex predator that size would leave unmistakable evidence in whale populations, in fossil deposits, in the food chain itself, and none of that evidence exists in the modern record. The largest predatory shark in Earth's history is gone, and the ocean's own data confirms it. A 20-million-year reign ended by cold water and a smaller, hungrier rival. And now, for the animal every single person watching this video already had in their head the moment the countdown began. Number 1. Tyrannosaurus rex. Hell Creek Formation, Montana, 66 million years ago, on what would turn out to be one of the final ordinary afternoons of the entire Mesozoic era. A 12-meter-long predator weighing up to 9 metric tons, heavier than 2 full-grown African elephants combined, moves through a forest at the absolute peak of its power, with a bite force strong enough to crush bone, estimated by researchers, including work from paleontologist Gregory Erickson, as the strongest bite of any land animal that has ever been measured. Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't just large, it was engineered dominance, binocular vision sharper than a hawk's, a sense of smell rivaling a modern vulture's, and jaws capable of shattering the bones of prey outright, rather than simply tearing flesh from them. It sat at the absolute top of the North American food chain for roughly 2 million years, so completely unchallenged that adult T-Rex fossils show almost no evidence of predation from any other species. Therefore, when we talk about dominance in the animal kingdom, this is usually the shape it takes in our minds. Total, unquestioned, permanent. But here's the twist that undoes every assumption on this entire list. It took less than a day. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers wide struck the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of billions of nuclear weapons, triggering wildfires, blocking out the sun with debris, and collapsing the food chain from the bottom up within months. Tyrannosaurus rex, the most efficient killing machine terrestrial evolution had ever produced, had no adaptation for a catastrophe like that. Nothing did. Some researchers argue the dinosaurs were already in a slow decline before the impact, weakened by volcanic activity in what is now India. Others maintain the asteroid alone was sufficient to end them outright. The debate continues, but the outcome doesn't. Within a geological instant, the most dominant predator in Earth's history was gone. 10 monsters, 10 thrones, every single one eventually empty. So here's the thesis again, the one we opened with. Dominance was never permanent on this planet. Insects the size of cars lost their kingdom to a change in the air. Armored fish lost theirs to poisoned water. Flying giants, giant snakes, saber-tooths, monitor lizards, mammoths, sharks, and finally, the most perfect predator ever built on land. All of them, without exception, got evicted from the top of the food chain by forces they never saw coming and could never have fought. We've walked through 300 million years of thrones, rising and falling, and if there's one pattern running underneath all 10 of them, it's this. The animals that fell weren't weak. They were, each in their own era, the strongest thing alive. So what does that actually say about whoever happens to be sitting on the throne right now? If you want to keep going deeper into the creatures that ruled this planet before us, there's more of this story waiting. Subscribe, and let's find the next one together.